Hello and welcome to another episode of The Clever Dev. Today we are going to look at the collapse component in MUI, and specifically I will use it in a table, and you can see that I've actually got it allowing multiple rows to be opened at the same time, and it can track which row is open and close that row. And then we'll also take a look at the card component, a simpler example, but in that one we can easily take a look at the DOM and just really understand how the collapse component is working in the DOM. So you can see that the collapse actually renders as quite a few divs here. There's at least 3 divs there with the collapse. So if you're interested in this, then stick around. Here we are in the expand table that I've created, and as you can see, I've got a lot of code in place already, including some imports that are not being used yet but will be used. I like to keep them in there for the sake of time. So just to go over things quickly, I have quite a bit of data already in place. It's being pulled in using Faker, and I have TypeScript, so I've got an interface for that data. I got a little bit of default styling on the table, so it's not really about the styling or the data in this one. What it is about is adding, you could say, an invisible row that can be expanded or collapsed. So let's take a look at our content here inside of our table. So a typical table has a table head and a table body. The table head has a table row, and each cell in that row has some kind of title for that column. And then down here in the table body, we've got a pretty similar setup. We've got a table row, and then each table cell has the respective data for that column. And we're looping through our addresses array and rendering multiple table rows in the body section. One row, of course, for each record in our addresses, so we can render, let's say, the street address, zip code, city, state, etc. So anyway, an important note I like to mention anytime I'm doing a video on table is that the table does not really have a column perspective, right? You see table header, table row, table cell, table body. You don't see a column component anywhere. The data grid has a column focus. It has a column prop, and that's really what controls its layout, but the table is not like that at all. So sometimes I'll use the word column because that's how we visualize a table, but there's not really a column in here. So with all that said, what we need to do here to use the collapse component is we need to keep the state so that we know which row is expanded or collapsed, and then we actually need to have a separate row that contains that collapse component that can be expanded or collapsed. And sparing you some details, I attempted a couple methods of adding that table row with a collapse, and so what I'll show in this video is the best method that makes it totally invisible, and it doesn't even render in the DOM, so unless it's expanded, so it's pretty lightweight. So anyway, of course, another prerequisite is that we actually import this collapse component. So interestingly, collapse is its own component in Material UI. With that said, let's actually get into the code. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add the state variable, and I'm going to create an example where the collapse only expands one row, and if another row is clicked, then the collapse will collapse the original row and expand the new row, and then I'll update it to a multiple expand. So all the rows or any variety of rows can be expanded at the same time, and they only get collapsed if you click on the specific expanded row. So anyway, let's add our state variable. So just a simple, I'll call it open, and set open, and just use state on that. And I will start it out with the value of -1, because, of course, our data in this addresses array is 0 based, and so if I had started it with, let's say, 0, then that would start the first row, the 0th index, already expanded, and we don't want that. So here we are looking at our table cell, and inside of here what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an icon button. And this icon button is what will actually control the click, and so we will actually put a child inside of it, this icon, and so our icon button on its own doesn't have anything really visual about it, but if we put an icon inside of it, then it gives clickable properties to that icon. So the first thing that we need to do is add our click handler on the icon button. And we'll keep it pretty straightforward. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have a simple arrow function, and it will directly call the set open. That is the setter for that state value that we created. And we're going to do a little bit of logic to determine what value should be set in the set open. So if open already exists and it's equal to the index from this addresses map, the index that we're on. So for the first row, that'd be if set open equals 0, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the open value equal to -1. Remember, we're doing only one row expand and collapse at a time. So that will close this row and make sure that no rows are open. However, if it's not, then this is going to set the value to index. So let's say open was already set to 2, the third row is open, remember this is 0 based, then it will instead set the open value to 0 for the first row if the first row icon button was clicked. So now we've got our state value being set properly, but we need to update the visual cue with this icon right here. So what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to say open equal to index. And if it is, then we'll do a thing. And if it's not, we'll do a different thing. So let me also add a parenthesis here just to make it a little more clear. So here we go. I will set the value to a similar icon, but instead of keyboard arrow down icon, I'm going to set the child as keyboard arrow up icon, and I've already done the import for that. Otherwise, then we'll use this down icon. Okay, so that's all in place, and let's go ahead and take a look at our results and make sure everything's rendering okay so far. So far so good, and we've got all that we expect in here, which is that our icon flips around, or really it swaps out the icon based on whatever's clicked. And you can see that if I click on one row on the icon, then if another icon was flipped up, then it's going to be flipped to the down chevron. So that's all good. Now let's actually add the code for that collapsible row. Our collapsible row is going to actually be a sibling to the row that actually has visual data, including our icon button. So that means that each iteration of addresses is going to render both that visual row and this collapsed row that's going to be invisible unless it's expanded. So we'll say table row. And inside of here, I'll go ahead and on camera build out the values that we need in here. So we've got our table cell, and inside of this table cell is where I'm actually going to have the collapse. So I'm going to have it just all be inside of a single table cell. While that may seem a little bit odd, it just depends on what data is in there. So I'm just going to have a box inside of here. And that box will just have some text, and I'll put some styling on it. So some silly text, it's me. And we'll show the index on this as well. So there we go. Now, here comes the part that we actually need that collapse, because we're looking at this. This is going to render as it is. It's going to render with every iteration. So we need to get that collapse in there. So the collapse will be inside of this table cell, inside of this table row. So let's add that collapse here. And I will wrap this box in that collapse. So simple as that, everything should be working. So we can see that our collapses are visible. So that tells me we need to go in and look at our collapse and make sure that we tell it when it actually needs to be open and when it needs to be closed. So here we are back in our code, and collapse has a prop called in. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say open equals index. So the in ultimately just accepts a Boolean, and we're going to give it the evaluation here, which is the state value. If it's equal to our current row index, then the collapse needs to be open. So that's all it would take to actually get it open, and I'm going to add just a little bit of code. I'm going to add a timeout on here and an unmount on exit. These are just cleanup things. Now I'm going to go to our table row, add a little bit of styling here, Actually in the table cell. I'll do it on the table cell. So here I'm going to say call span equals 5. And the purpose of this is to make sure that we have enough room to display all the content, in this case just our box. So when we looked at it a moment ago, then you couldn't really see the data that was inside of it. It was way shrunken down. So adding that call span will take care of that, and I'll simply add an SX to get a little bit of styling on here. And I'll remove the border actually, just to make sure that it doesn't give us any trouble. So our table cell's looking good. Our collapse should be looking good. Let's style the box just a little bit. And I'll set a width to it, make sure that it expands completely, like we expect. Give it some background color so we can really tell the difference. Don't want it to blend in with our table too much. Give it a min height. And just a few other things. There we go. Now let's take a look at all this. That should really be a functional table with expand and collapse on one row at a time. All right, let's check it out. That looks good. Now let's make this multi-expand and collapse. The first thing that we need to do is we need to update our state value up here. So we'll still keep the same name, and then instead of saying useState and setting it to -1, we are going to tell it that it can be a number array, but we'll just start it as an empty array. So in that state, that means that no rows are expanded. And we're going to need a more complex click handler, so I'm going to go ahead and create one here. And I'll call it handle click. And just get some of the basic stuff in here. So what I will say on our click handler is we're going to pass in a click index. And that will be of type number. So what we want to do inside of our click handler is we need to manually add or remove the click index from our open array. So what we want to check is if the open array includes our clicked index, then we want to remove it. And otherwise, we'll actually add it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, I'm going to create a copy, and I'm going to filter and remove that clicked index. And we'll just say return true if element, or return this value, I should say, if element is not equal to the clicked index. So this is saying remove, or actually create a new array that has all the values except for this clicked index value. So now we have open copy, it's a new array, and so we can just say set open copy. So pretty cool. And it's just taking VS Code a minute to catch up. Now in our else down here, kind of the same idea, but in reverse. We're going to say open copy equals a copy of the existing open. And I'll say open copy dot push. And then we'll say set open is equal to open copy again. The next thing that we need to do is we actually need to use this new handle click. So we come down here to our icon button, and what we're going to do is we're going to say instead of onClick and directly calling setOpen, we're actually going to make it a little simpler down here, and we will just give it an arrow function and directly pass in the index that we just got. So this index is, of course, the index of our addresses iteration. So now we don't want to say does open equal index because open is an array now. So we want to instead say does open include index. And a similar idea down here. So in our collapse, if open includes index. So let's take a look at this now and make sure that all is well, and that we have the functionality we expect. And it looks good, and I don't see any errors in the DOM. So it looks like we're looking good. Now we'll move on to the card component, and I'll give an example of that, and we'll take a look at the DOM as well. Here we are looking at our card, and you can see once again I've got some code in place already. Really a very simple card. So card is just a wrapper, and it renders as a paper component. Essentially, it's a card component, but it's got the MUI paper class on it, so it's got that same look and feel. And so inside of here, we just have a card header, and we have our card content. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an action to the card header, and I'm going to add a collapse to the card content, and of course we're going to have a state value. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to set my state value, or create my state value. So once again, I'll just say open and set open. And I'll say use state, and I'll set it to a value of false for now. And before I add the action into the card header, I'm going to go ahead and add in the collapse. So I am going to wrap the card content. It's a little simpler than with the table. With the table, I had to worry more about getting the styling just right to make sure that there was nothing visible of the collapsed row when the card, when the table was not supposed to have that row expanded. So anyway, we've got our collapse here, and what I'm going to do is go ahead and add the same code as last time. And once again, it's simpler. It's just a Boolean. There's only one card. It's either expanded or collapsed. I don't have to worry about index or anything else like that. So also I will add my timeout equals auto and my unmount on exit. Just some cleanup stuff. So as of right now, we have a card that only the header is showing on because our open is set to false, and so this collapse is going to be collapsed by default and the content will not be visible. But let's add in our action and get, well, a little action going. So similar to the table, then I'm going to have an icon button. And inside of here, I am going to have an onClick. And I will say set open. And here we can use this little trick of just setting it to its opposite. And I will say size equals small on this one. So we've got our icon button in place. It handles clicks, but we don't have anything visible yet to actually indicate where to click. So I will use the same keyboard arrow up icon when open is true so that we can collapse. Otherwise, I will use keyboard arrow down icon. So that should be all that we need. We've got our set open, even though VS Code's still trying to figure out if it's used or not. But the compiler is happy, so let's take a look at this, and we'll also dive into the DOM a little bit. All right, so we've got our very simple card, and it is in fact working, so fantastic. Now let's take a look at the actual collapse component and how it renders in the DOM. So this is a div that was right above the collapse, and then down here is our actual card content component. So that means that these three divs are all MUI Collapse, and we can see the class on them: MUI Collapse-root, MUI Collapse-wrapper, and MUI Collapse-wrapper inner. So pretty complex. That's pretty heavy for that one component to be needed to render and get this collapse action going. And what's really interesting is that when it's collapsed, it's actually not rendering at all. So here's our card header, and here's that div that wraps the collapse. So pretty interesting that it renders, pretty interesting to me that it's a component and how heavy it is. But anyway, so you can actually, if you wanted, you could target this MUI Collapse root class, and you could add some styling, but I would tend to stick with styling whatever is inside of it because that takes up as much space as that collapse. So why not just style that?